Welcome to the Decision Clinic. Dr. Susan McGinty, I'm interested to hear what troubles you in the world of decision making, perhaps give you a decision diagnosis that will give you some freedom to move forward. So perhaps let's start, Susan. If you can tell me a little bit about yourself. One of the things I know as a decision specialist is that context is everything in decision making. So understanding your world a little bit would be very helpful for me. So I'd just love to hear where you're at, what you're up to, and what ails you in the decision.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Lovely introduction, and I'm super excited to be talking to you. I've just recently stepped into my own business full time, and it's something that's been growing over the last 5 years or so. My background is in science as a chemist, and I've always been very passionate about science. I took that love of science into the defence space, where I supported defence on their scientific policies, different approaches they were advising, informing the advice they provide to government. That was a lot of fun. But I noticed that for women in STEM around me, there were some real challenges in breaking into the leadership level, and confidence challenges, especially around how they could bring their own authentic leadership style to the environment they were working in. This sense that they couldn't do that, they were constrained by this real masculine paradigm of STEM. So at the same time, I started coaching. I undertook a coaching qualification, and that was like a real bullet for me. I was like, wow, this is such a powerful tool to use, and really was drawn to applying that to help other people solve their problems. Help other people help themselves to solve their problems, rather. That brought me to, over the last 5 years, slowly getting more into the space of coaching women in leadership, particularly women in leadership in the STEM space and the security space. So I sort of got a 25-year career in science and the national security space. So two areas where women are underrepresented in leadership, where there's quite specific male paradigms in leadership, and where we really need more women in leadership. Now I work full-time in helping organisations develop their female leaders, emerging and established, with their leadership skills. And my vision is to see 50% gender representation in leadership at all levels of leadership.
Great. Wow. What a wonderful goal and vision. As a decision doctor, what improves decision making is diversity of perspective and opinion and representation.
Absolutely.
And I see plenty of people through my clinic where the thing that's missing is any kind of diversity. There's a lot of homogeneity in decision making, and it's the same people, the same types of people, the same opinions coming together, and no opportunity for really making better decisions. So there's a big contribution available there for decision making.
I think that's something that concerns me with the technological challenges that we face for the future, even things like climate change. How are we going to develop climate policies, and then how are we going to develop the technologies that are going to support those and deliver those climate policies? But in the defence space as well, we have such opportunity for rich diversity and bringing that to decision making and leadership, and we just don't seem to be embracing it at the speed that we need to. So I worry that we actually are missing huge opportunities to impact real life outcomes, not just at a national level, but at a global level as well. It's the situation that I've described for women in STEM leadership representation. It's mirrored across the world. It's not just a problem that Australia has.
I think as we explore really what you're facing and where decision making can help, my comment at the beginning around context being everything in decision making, I can hear there's a world of context. There's a lot of history that has created the world of STEM and the world of defense, shaped the way it is and constrained the way it is. And unless we can deal with that context, bringing new eyes, new perspectives, and more female participation is always going to be much harder without looking at the context from a decision-making point of view. It's easy to ignore that and just think we're operating in a vacuum, and that's not the case.
Culture is a fundamental thing holding back the embracement of more women in leadership roles, and actually those environments, the STEM environment in particular, being sort of really supportive of women. A lot of women fall out of the STEM pipeline at mid-career level, which is such a shame. All that experience, knowledge, expertise, and innovation potential being lost because it's been a really male culture. And you're right. The context and the history is really important to understand. And so we can't change that culture overnight. there's lots of work being done, not just in Australia, but other countries as well, to try and address the barriers for women in STEM, which is fantastic. And that'll slowly change the culture. But I think there needs to be an additional shift in mindset, which is culturally anchored around the value that women bring to leadership and decision making.
Right. Interesting, that value word, because when I think from my lens of decision making, one of the most important things in decision making is understanding all of the value that's provided in a decision outcome when you look at a range of alternatives or options. When we're looking at a range of people that you might consider to bring forward in certain roles or to engage in certain ways, it's easy to have a very narrow lens of value and just say, oh, value looks like experience or looks like skills or looks like whatever. And that lack of consideration of all aspects of value leads to poorer decision outcomes. The idea of a conversation around what is the value that people bring, and let's say women specifically in STEM disciplines, for example, what's the value, what are all of the dimensions of value that they bring to allow for decisions that are much more across the board rather than specifically focused on certain dimensions that might not be and often aren't the whole story. It's a much broader story of value than simply have you got the right skills and have you got the experience, especially in that context as well.
Yeah, and look, to be honest, that's not something that I fully appreciated in depth until I read your book, Paul. So
I'm glad you read it.
Yeah, I've read your book multiple times. That value element needs to be really, as you pointed out, really broadly considered. Yeah.
Yes. Sounds like we're in the right conversation. So I'm glad you've found your way to my clinic today. So is there something specific that's in your mind around a particular problem or challenge, or is this a more general situation that perhaps we can find a diagnosis for that will help give you some freedom?
Yeah, so look, in my mind, it's quite specific, but it's actually probably more general, to be honest. The key challenge I'm feeling is, and have for a little while, is how do I help STEM industries understand that value that women can bring to leadership, particularly around diversity of thought, which leads to innovation, but also in the people sense. With all the sort of STEM organisations and related organisations I've worked with, there's still this really transactional male approach to leading teams, to interacting in the workplace, and that works to an extent, but how can I help those organisations understand that there's a whole additional layer that can be provided to their leadership depth that they're just not aware of because they haven't experienced it yet?
Right. I think I can provide some assistance within the realm of decision making. That sounds like a useful conversation for us to have right now while you're here in the clinic, is to explore what are those dimensions of value. We could look at this from the perspective of a decision that someone is making to perhaps broaden their opportunity for female participation in STEM. Perhaps we could pick a hypothetical example that will give us something specific to kind of help me support you in this.
Yeah, so something that I'm particularly curious about is how organisations develop their leadership talent, particularly focus on developing female leadership talent, because leaders don't just emerge, and most organisations are suffering retention issues at the moment. They're losing real experience and real expertise. Leadership development for women not only provides a good employee value proposition to help retain their staff, but it gives them a pipeline of female leaders so that it's not just at the top level that they've got leadership representation with gender equality, but all through the organisation at all levels. How would they make a decision about investing in their emerging female leaders, developing them as leaders?
It's imagine a hypothetical organisation, and they're looking forward. They're thinking about their talent development. They're thinking about the future of their organisation and making some decisions as to where to invest in leadership development. And the question is, how might their decision making be improved to provide a better environment that's more conducive and enables more female participation for greater diversity across their organisation? Look at that. I imagine that's quite a common situation. The current context of a lot more mobility, a lot more talent walking out the door, We know part of the context, of course, is the recent history of the pandemic and people's experience of working in different environments and different ways of engaging and working that have challenged much of the historic context. I suspect that's provided a mindset in the workforce of greater freedom, greater choice, and more empowerment to make their own decisions. Therefore, organizations are probably grappling with what's our response to that and what decisions might we be making to say, well, actually, how do we ensure we retain the right people? And specifically in your case, how do we ensure we pull more women through into leadership, particularly in the STEM realm or the defense realm? Great. That's certainly a place that we can look at from a diagnosis point of view. I think a couple of things that occur to me straight away is when we're making decisions, we're often very focused on the short-term outcomes. In a leadership development sense, we might be very focused on what are the gaps or roles I need to fill quickly in the next month, 3 months, coming right in front of me. And often that short-term focus is a bias for us as human beings. We can't see past the end of that. And often we miss the long-term opportunity because we're so focused on the short-term. So one thing I can already hear in what you're saying is that that pipeline you talked about it's a kind of longer term view. So I think firstly, those people in those decision-making positions looking at talent development, somehow highlighting the longer-term perspective as well as the shorter-term perspective. We have to have a long-term view as well as an immediate. We have to trade off both of those, and decision-making is all about trade-offs. So I think there's one thing there straight away, that a greater visibility of that long-term view. And perhaps I can speculate, and this is your area, not mine, but just hearing you speak, I can imagine that pipeline also has a knock-on effect. So the long-term view might not just be the specific leaders that we can develop now, but then what those leaders pull through in terms of female opportunities in follow-through. Is that part of the situation, would you say?
Oh, absolutely, Paul. And this is something that I'm really trying to educate organisations on. There's a lot of effort being put by the government and by lots of organisations in Australia, but elsewhere around the world, on getting more girls into STEM education, which is fantastic. That absolutely has to happen. But also getting more women into STEM careers and looking at ways to manage workplace situations, policies to be more supportive of women in those workplaces. I think what's potentially not been recognised as much as it needs to be yet is that at the same time, we need to be having more women in leadership roles because they do pull through other women. So research has indicated that when you have women in research, women in leadership roles, it encourages more women into leadership roles. Right. It's that old adage of what you can't see, you can't be. Yes. And the flip of that is what you see shows that you can aspire to that. We definitely need to be building the pool of women in senior leadership, but we need to be developing the women in sort of, the middle management, but also the emerging leadership roles so that they can then be aspiring to and moving into senior leadership roles. And then those women, the emerging leaders and those in the sort of middle management, they'll be encouraging other women who can see them leading teams, making decisions, having impact. They'll be encouraging other women in their early career to stay focused and inspired. It will have that impact of pulling more women through, absolutely.
Great. So I can hear that if we stand in the shoes of these decision makers looking at their leadership and people development decisions, one thing is to create the environment for their decisions that accommodate for that long-term view and articulate all of what long-term looks like, not just long-term as in where does this person going, but also what does that provide in terms of follow-through and pull-through. I can hear that as one dimension. So what might you consider, if I think about the value that women provide in leadership, what might you say is something that's unique about that compared to, let's say, men, or compared to the status quo? So what might some of those areas of value that often get unconsidered, but actually are very plain to us?
There's some long established research that indicates that women's leadership traits and characteristics are much more communal, whereas men's are much more agentic. So what does that mean? That means men are a bit more transactional, they're quite task-oriented. This is a generalization, of course, and they can be quite confident in how they speak. Women, they've got the traits that kind of support others, that encourage others into the conversation, that sort of manage conflict. So I think One of the things that can be overlooked that women bring to leadership is this ability to more developed emotional intelligence, be better communicators, be more empathetic and more supportive, and they can be quite focused on supporting and bringing others up, so that they're much more team focused and team oriented in general than worried about just succeeding themselves. So they bring that team success, develop other people. So they're great at mentoring and coaching, and they kind of build this pretty supportive environment for their teams to flourish. Research has indicated that women have a 15 to 25% impact over time on profitability. That's been pretty well established. But women bring diversity of thought because they bring different perspectives and experiences. And so that diversity of thought can lead to innovation, can lead to better decision making. Women are often more focused on the people side of the organisation, thinking about the organisation as a whole and organisational culture. They're important. When you're thinking about the longevity of a tech company, for example, you absolutely have to have people who are guns on the technology, and women and men both have those skills. Anecdotally, I've heard from a lot of my clients that the men kind of live, breathe 24 hours a day, the tech. Certainly there's some research been shown, a 25-year longitudinal study, high-achieving STEM students who became STEM leaders compared to those who didn't, and particularly the men who became STEM leaders versus the women who became STEM leaders, they were much more devoted to their careers. They were much more devoted to the science-related hobbies and interests, whereas women had a more diverse set of interests. So we know that in general, from some research, but also anecdotally, a technologist specialist, they'll be in the tech all day long on the weekends as well. Women can find that in those environments really challenging because they feel like they're not keeping up. But they actually bring additional skills and contributions that are more about the team, bringing out the best in others, developing others, and thinking about things differently.
Sorry to jump in, but I can hear a few things that are interesting. And one of the things with decision making is what we want to do is provide our way of making decisions that gets us to better outcomes, not necessarily driving for a specific outcome. So I'm sort of dancing between a clear specific outcome I can see that's a good thing, which is more women in STEM, more women in STEM leadership. That's a good outcome. What we want is a decision way of thinking where that naturally arises rather than we just turn the tap in one direction or another. Because we also know in decision making that doesn't give us decisions that last. What happens is someone starts to say, well, hang on a minute, that was just you forced the decision in a different direction. So that's what I'm unpicking here. And it's great to use the example of specifically what's the uniqueness of value women provide, because then we can say, well, if we say in our choice about leadership, we care about these dimensions of uniqueness of value, then naturally what will merge will be more of that coming forward. Women are a natural fit to that. And it may be, if we take away the generalization and start thinking about some candidates we have in front of us, there are some men with those characteristics and some women without those characteristics, and that would still get us to a good outcome. You talked about is this more communal way of thinking, bringing others along. So when I think about a dimension of value, that's kind of like leverage. That's a little bit like saying, if this person comes forward to leadership, what we then get is a big effect around them because of their commitment to creating more collaboration, wider engagement from others, the coaching and mentoring side of things. And I think that's also sounds like a dimension that's highly, in today's context, something that's really important. A lot of organizations will have seen the value of collaboration and how to drive collaboration and found it harder in the virtual environment forced upon us by the pandemic. So I would imagine that dimension of leverage would be very valuable to a leader going, I need someone that can bring leverage. And that sounds like a natural characteristic. I can hear that. The other one I heard was an adaptability thing, which is, as you said, it's one thing to be laser focused on the tech, live and breathe the tech. And you need some of that, of course, but also you need something of the adaptability that says, well, tomorrow we're facing something else. And how do we move our way of thinking? So I think adaptability has been something that's really, again, come to the fore with teams becoming unavailable or individuals becoming unavailable with COVID issues, etc., has had us to go, well, how do we still continue to what we're doing? And adaptability, being able to turn your hand to something different, sounds like another aspect. If I was a decision maker, I'd want something that says, oh yeah, there's an aspect of adaptability here that gives me some greater opportunity for where that person can provide value. At the moment, I'm hearing some specific things. I heard that long-term thing, which I think is important. So a kind of long-term pull through. I heard this sort of leverage idea of how do you have a wider impact from an individual. And I heard something about adaptability, just as three sort of dimensions of value that were I a sort of leader, if I accommodated those, as well as some of the obvious ones around capability, we shouldn't pretend that that doesn't matter. There's aspects of capability in there. The other thing I wanted to pack a little bit is you talk about the research that shows greater profitability comes from women in leadership. Do you know what's behind that? Is there anything else that we're missing if I think about what value looks like?
Yes, it was a McKinsey report done initially in 2015, and they've done additional research, I think 2018, 2020, sort of following on from that. Look, I think it really comes down to the increased profitability comes from the diversity of thought, the better decision making.
Right. In decision making, sometimes we think about them as one-off. Who am I going to pick now? It's that person. And sometimes we think about them as more what I would call portfolio, a suite of things. I've got these set of things I'm picking between. And the idea of diversity, which from the decision science world, no question, diversity improves our decision outcomes. And I can hear you saying the same thing from the point of view of STEM and leadership. Bringing that in as a dimension can be tricky, because if you're looking at one person, does that one person bring diversity, or do I have diversity across my range of things? So I think that is probably a dimension that would, again, come into that decision making. It just needs dealing with carefully to say, well, am I looking at the next 10 people, everyone I've got, plus the new ones I'm adding into my leadership development program to make sure I add that value of diversity?
The diversity element is not just gender-based. No. It's cultural diversity, age and experience diversity, and diversity elements like disability and different lived experience.
Yeah, thank you. And that was popping into my mind as well, because it's easy in context to hear the word diversity and immediately jump to one dimension of diversity, let's say gender. And actually, gender provides for diversity in different ways because of different neurobiology, because of different makeup. And actually, it's those are the diverse things. The diversity of thought is something we want to bring, even if it's found more generally in, let's say, gender. Aspects of things like neurodiversity are a big part of the mix to what can provide for new thinking, especially when you talk to points like innovation. Many organizations looking at the future can't possibly look like the past, and therefore it doesn't work just to continue on this trajectory. We must always keep making sure when we talk about diversity, we're looking at, again, the spectrum of what that entails for the outcome that diversity provides, which is new ways of thinking and looking at problems we're facing. Our appointment time's nearly up, Susan. I appreciate you bringing this to me into my clinic. Perhaps in summary, I'm just interested to hear whether I've missed anything. My diagnosis would be, were I having this conversation with, say, a leader in an organization, particularly a STEM organization, looking at where to bring their next leaders from and pushing against the context that says do more of the same, I would be encouraging a decision process that accommodates a spectrum of dimensions of value, as well as the core capability side of things, but particularly including a long-term view of value. So what is the 5-year view? And incorporated in that should not only be the individuals, but also what comes with them. I would be thinking about adaptability. How do we make sure that who we bring forward can be deployed in different ways and be responsive to this very uncertain and changing world? I'd be looking for people that can really provide leverage. In other words, value beyond them across the organization, particularly concepts like greater collaboration and community work, or support for others, or engaging with and helping others maximize the value they provide. If we can accommodate those in that sort of decision making, then we're going to provide a much richer environment for women to be able to participate, an environment that pulls through for all those characteristics and provides a more diverse organization, better set up for the future. How does that sound? Is that helpful?
Yes.
Is that going to provide them some direction and maybe some conversation for you to have with them?
So that's really helpful, Paul. Thank you. And I think it's going to definitely give them useful things to think about, and they need to decide where they want to prioritize that value. But absolutely, that helps me have conversations with them.
Thanks, Susan.